I think we should be okay. I'll close the door here, and I think we should be okay. But maybe just raise your voice a little bit.
Okay. Would it actually be okay if before I start, everybody went around and introduced themselves, like your name, I guess what you
Sure.
do?
Okay, no problem. We'll make it really quick though, because I want to make sure you have time for your talk. So,
Okay,
Tara, if you could just all very quickly, so we get to it.
Tariq Ata, I'm an Imam of a masjid in Orange County, California.
sure.
Sharif Yusuf. I'm the religious director of Wasat, Third Space in Seattle, Washington.
Uh-huh.
Mike Swice, I served as the Director of Outreach at Talib for a sensible amount of time.
Sufi Ahmad, I'm on the board of Rabata.
Liz Ruqayya, I'm a teacher. Salahuddin Muhammad, I'm a Muslim chaplain.
Rajai Fatiha, social justice and civil rights.
Yasser Khan, teacher and Imam in Dallas.
That's it.
Okay,
Students in the
awesome.
room.
So the presentation today is on neo-traditionalism in Islam. A little bit about myself. I did my undergraduate and graduate studies in Islamic studies. My undergraduate studies at Vanderbilt, and then my master's at Harvard Divinity School. And I graduated undergrad in 2018, and then I finished my master's in 2020. And then in 2021, I came to Egypt, where I've been for the past 4 years. And I'm currently in year 3 of 4 of the Rawaq program at the Azhar Masjid. And then I'm in year 2 of 3 of Dar Ifta al-Misriya's 3-year Ifta program. And in that program, they train us on how to give fatwa. A good portion of the program also involves people, regular people. Dar Ifta al-Misriya is a fatwa office run by the Egyptian government and headed by the Grand Mufti of Egypt. And a lot of regular Egyptians will come for fatwa. So part of the training program involves answering fiqh questions and giving fatwa under the supervision of the muftis at Dar Ifta. I also, until a couple of months ago, I worked as a researcher at Dar Ifta and as an advisor to the spokesperson of the Grand Mufti of Egypt. And then I teach Islamic studies classes online. So I teach Hanafi fiqh online, I teach usul online to just in private classes. And then I teach at Mishka University, and then I teach at the Ella Collins Institute, run by Imam Sohaib Webb. And then I'm also a PhD student at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, where I am doing my PhD dissertation on modern kind of 20th century kind of Islamic political thought. So with regard to neo-traditionalism, it kind of falls into people will speak about how Muslims have generally 4 categories by which Muslims have approached modernity. And a lot of these categories can be sort of subdivided. But the first of these categories is Salafism. And Salafism is basically premised on the idea that part of the reason that Muslims lost a lot of, you could say, political power in modernity is because Muslims were kind of plagued by all sorts of innovations and shirk and all of this sort of stuff. So the way the Muslim Ummah revives its original greatness is by going back to the way of the first 3 generations. And then neo-traditionalism is based on this idea that, or neo-traditionalism, I'll get into in kind of future PowerPoints, or in future slides. Modernism is based on this idea that Muslims need to kind of adjust to modernity. We need to be more rational. We need to be more modern. All of these sorts of things. Modernists might say things like, the way the madahib approach issues of gender are things that need to be done away with. The way Muslims believe in things like miracles, believing in angels and stuff. We need to reinterpret these things, that sort of stuff. And then Islamism is basically this idea that Muslims need to revive certain political power, often through the context of the modern nation state. And Islamists in reality often have a basis in the kind of first 3 groups. So Hassan Hudaybi, who's a very prominent figure in the Egyptian Brotherhood, he wrote a famous work where he basically said the Brotherhood kind of has 4 currents: the modernists, the traditionalists, the Qutbis, and the Salafis. And he basically said that it was his fear that the Qutbis and the Salafis in the Egyptian Brotherhood would gain power over the modernists and the traditionalists. So in approaching neo-traditionalism, one can kind of understand it as one of mainly four kind of approaches that Muslims take in the modern world. And then in the kind of academic study of religion, and in anthropology in general, and specifically in the context of the anthropology of religion, there's generally a division of what are called emic and etic approaches to religion. So an emic approach would be to have the way practitioners and insiders view that group, and an etic approach would be the way that outsiders view that group. A good example of this would be that if you ever hear Muslims talk about Christianity, a Muslim might say that Christians engage in shirk because they believe in the Trinity. It's three gods in one. A Christian will say, no, we are monotheistic. So from an emic perspective, Christians are very much monotheistic. From an etic perspective, specifically from the perspective of Muslims, they would say, no, this is not proper monotheism. So in understanding religious groups, it's very important to look at it from how insiders understand it, and then also from how outsiders understand it. So from a kind of insider's perspective, a neo-traditionalist will say, we are carrying the Islamic tradition in an unbroken chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ through our teachers. And they are carriers of this tradition. And they would say we focus on the three main sciences of Islam, that of traditional fiqh, and this translates into following one of the four madhabs of fiqh, that of the Hanafis, the Malikis, the Shafis, and the Hanbalis. One of the traditional Aqidah, which translates into following one of the kind of two Sunni schools of Aqidah, that being the Ash'ari Aqidah and the Maturidi Aqidah, and then also the Hanbali sub-school, and then that of proper ihsan, which is manifested in tasawwuf. And this could be in the context of a specific tariqah or what is called kind of tasawwuf amali. And this, in a kind of broad perspective, entails a respect and authority for figures that maybe Salafis and modernists and Islamists, they might not consider to be authorities. So for example, someone like Sheikh Abu Hassan al-Shadili, for a neo-traditionalist, he has a specific authority on the science of how to purify your heart and all of this sort of stuff. For a Salafi or for a modernist or for an Islamist, they are either not considered, or someone like him might even be someone that is considered to be, a heretic or something like that. Because Ibn Taymiyyah has, a famous work where he writes against, Sheikh Abu Hassan al-Shadili. So the neo-traditionalist kind of, from an insider's perspective, from an emic perspective, is based on traditional Sunni fiqh, following one of the four madhabs, traditional aqidah, and then traditional tasawwuf. And they will also have a certain critique of modernity, where they will say that modernity caused a rupture within these sciences. So we are in a need to kind of revive these sciences. So they will say it's a big issue amongst Muslims today that if you go to a masjid, people are not teaching madhabi fiqh. People are not teaching the works of Aqidah. Tasawwuf and certain practices around it have been sidelined. So they will be proponents of things like group dhikr, things like mawlids, things like that. Within politics, different neo-traditionalists will have different political approaches. A good example of this is the politics of someone like Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf is very different from that of someone like Imam Zaid Shakir. And one could argue, I think within neo-traditionalism, some neo-traditionalists will say that, those who do not have our political approach do not properly understand the tradition. That is kind of one current. Other people will say these different approaches reflect different approaches that existed within the Sahaba themselves. A good example of this would be that Imam Hussein and Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiallahu anhuma, they were people who were very critical to the rule of Yazid, and they were people who engaged in rebellion against Yazid and against the Umayyads. Someone like Abdullah ibn Umar, radiallahu anhuma, he was someone who did not believe he was not a supporter of Yazid's rule, but at the same time, he feared that actual rebellion would cause more issues. So he did not kind of rebel against Yazid's rule. So they'll say that the quietist current exists within the tradition. The kind of idea of confronting the state also exists within the tradition. So that is neo-traditionalism from kind of like an insider's perspective. Before I go into anything else, do you guys have any questions or any comments or anything on that? Okay, perfect. And then I like to say those kind of four movements that I mentioned, a lot of the times you kind of know them when you see them. So, for example, that of Salafism, that of Islamism, that of modernism, and then that of neo-traditionalism. So I made a list of kind of prominent kind of American Muslim organizations, and I'll kind of ask you guys which of these four that they fall into. So, like, for example, if I were to mention ISNA, where would you guys think ISNA falls? Is ISNA Salafi? Is it Islamist? Is it modernist? Is it traditionalist? What would you guys say?
Probably become more modernist.
Uh-huh.
There's consensus in the room that's a little more modernist.
Okay. Yeah, you could say that. Islam itself has roots in the Brotherhood though.
Right.
But
That's why it's a become. It's
yeah,
evolved into that.
yeah. Um, and something like Ikna, what would you guys say?
Islamist.
Yeah, it's like through and through, right? Ikna, it's like you can't, they're it's very much centered on the ideas of like Maududi and the Jamaat Islami and that sort of stuff. Something like Zaytuna College, where would you guys place them?
Stuff.
Salafism.
Salafism. No, we're just having some fun here. Neo-traditionalism is what we're saying. I'm just saying this because I'm closest to the mic.
Uh-huh. And then what about CARE?
Islamist.
Uh-huh. What about Mass?
Islamist.
Uh, what about the MSA?
Started by Islamists.
Moderate.
I think they're all over the place, so
They're figuring it out.
they're figuring it out.
That's an interesting thing about the MSA. Like technically the MSA has roots in the Brotherhood, but I think about my college MSA, they were just Muslim kids. Like no one really knew what anything was. Um, the Dar al-Islam movement, of which Imam Jamil al-Amin was the Amir.
I don't think it fits into the boxes.
They're saying it doesn't fit in any particular box.
Yeah. You could say they have Salafi elements, they have Islamist elements. There's a lot there, right? The mosque cares, the community of Imam Din Muhammad.
I think organizations that were rooted in America, their approach were done a bit differently from the organizations that were rooted outside of. So they might.
Uh-huh. I think that would be a good way of placing it because Imam Din Muhammad, you could say that in many of the ways that he speaks about abolishing madahib, stuff like that, he's a bit of a modernist. But then if you look at the community he was leading and in relation to what he was transitioning them out of, he was very much a traditionalist. And he sends students to Syria, he sends students to Turkey. So a lot of these things are not always solidly defined. Maqasid, the organization of Sheikh Yahya Rhodus, where would you kind of place them?
Neo-traditionals.
Neo-traditionalists, right? And then prominent American Muslim leaders also. Where would you guys place someone like Umar Suleiman?
Fine.
No, he's not modern. He's probably more Salafi, I would say. There's
Salafi marriage.
we're leaning kind of towards Salafism.
Yeah, right? A sort of soft Salafism, a sort of Islamism, that sort of stuff. And then someone like Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf or like someone like Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf, where would you guys place him?
Neo-traditionalist par excellence.
And then someone like Imam Majid.
We're stumped. We don't know.
Yeah, it was probably a little bit somewhere between kind of a neo-traditionalist in many respects, but his I think Imam Majid also has certain roots in the kind of like brotherhood elements of like Sudan. So he's probably now in the way he operates more neo-traditionalist, you could say. And then someone like Imam Amin Muhammad from New Jersey. I'm not sure if you guys know of him.
I'll be a tradition.
Uh-huh. Right? Someone like Dr. Shadi al-Masri.
They're like neo-traditionalists as well.
Uh-huh. And then I mentioned him a little bit, but someone like Imam Warthin Muhammad.
Are you talking about later in his life? If you go later in his life, like you said, in a sense, some of his students over to Syria and Turkey. So I don't want to say maybe um, neo traditionalist later on.
I think it's a mixture of two people.
You would say a mixture of neo-traditionalists and then what else?
I guess I'm getting the definition of the idea of adjusting to modernity, political power, something.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so Imam Muhammad is a little bit interesting that he doesn't fit perfectly into these categories, right? From one perspective where you look at him, he's a little bit of a neo-traditionalist. From another perspective, he's a little bit of a modernist. So there is some people do not neatly kind of fit into these boxes. Someone like Sheikh Yasser Qalbi, where would you guys place him?
He's still figuring it out.
Excellent. Reform.
Right? Yeah, like reform Salafi, right? In a sense. Someone like Khalid Abu al-Fadl, where do you guys place him?
Modernist.
That's right. But Khalid Abu al-Fadl is also interesting because he has roots also in kind of Islamist kind of movements. Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, where do you guys place him? Right? Neo-traditionalist through and through. So with a lot of these labels, you almost kind of know them when you see them. So that is neo-traditionalism from an outsider's perspective. Different critics may or not kind of agree with the way neo-traditionalists approach fiqh, the way they approach aqidah, the way they approach the tasawwuf. So some people might say, we don't believe in madhabi fiqh. We believe you go straight to the text and you interpret it yourself. That would be the approach of many Salafis, and the approach of a lot of modernists also, and even the approach of a lot of Islamists. Their approach to aqidah will also be different. Their approach to tasawwuf might be different. A lot of people might even agree with these things, but they will say that is not the emphasis on what we as Muslims should talk about. This might be the approach of some Islamists. They might say that yes, fiqh is important, aqidah is important, tasawwuf is important, but more important than going to your masjid and teaching a book of aqidah like Al-Kharid al-Bahiyya or the Tahawiyya is to teach certain aspects of the seerah that can give us political lessons and social lessons and that sort of stuff. And then people may also they may agree with the idea that modernity caused a great rupture within the Islamic church, or they might disagree with that idea, or they might agree with that idea. And even if they agree with that idea, they might disagree with the critiques of modernity that many neo-traditionalists have come to. So a good example of this is they might say that neo-traditionalists have come to a sort of implicit theodicy. So there is an idea amongst many traditionalists that we either blame the problems of the world on humankind, or we suggest that there is a divine wisdom in that. And they have this idea that the Muslim mind is decentered and disconnected from the tradition, and modernity has traumatized us in many ways. And therefore, we need to find a way to center and de-traumatize ourselves. And they will say that our biggest focus as Muslims should not necessarily be politics, but rather we should reconnect with the tradition, we should purify ourselves, we should build strong families. And then when we build strong individuals on a personal level, and then when we build strong families, and then we build strong communities, that will have kind of political repercussions. So that is one thing that oftentimes neo-traditionalists will be criticized for, that there is a sort of implicit theodicy and there is this sort of political quietism. One kind of major issue with this approach is that I remember when I was in grad school, there were Hindu kind of seminarians who were also studying at the seminary. And I remember some of them would even make Facebook statuses about this. They would say that there's a big problem that Hindus are protesting BJP rule in India because we should just purify ourselves and then society will get better. Obviously, there's kind of major issues with that approach. Because how can people purify themselves and kind of improve? How can people just focus on purifying themselves while there are people starving, while there are people who are victims of all sorts of structural oppression? So this is kind of a major critique of neo-traditionalism. Another critique will be what is called the retreat phenomenon. They will say that neo-traditionalists do these retreats. Things like the Rihla. I'm not sure if the Rihla is still active, but the Rihla used to be something that Zaytuna would do that would be a 40-day retreat in Malaysia or these places. And it would be a place to escape modernity. They will say that the retreat sells a packaged idea of tradition to a bunch of basically wealthy Westerners. Some of these Rihla retreats would be very expensive. And then other people will do kind of shorter retreats, 3-day retreats, week-long retreats. And they will say that these retreats are overpriced and they are inaccessible to working class people. I do not really buy this critique as much because a wide plethora of groups have retreats. Workplaces have retreats. I worked as a chaplain for 2 years at Boston College. Our MSA used to have a weekend retreat that we would do once every semester. Salafis, Islamists, modernist groups, they will organize trips to Umrah, to Jerusalem, to Turkey, etc. And yes, we can say international travel is out of reach for most Americans, but I do think that these organizations try to remedy those things through financial aid and such like stuff like that. But this is a critique that people have that, oh, neo-traditionalists do these kind of fancy bourgeoisie retreats that sell a packaged idea of tradition and that are inaccessible to most Americans. Another thing that they will talk about, and this is something I touched on earlier, is that they will appeal to a certain metaphysics that's like this abstract. Metaphysics is kind of this abstract theory that relates to the nature and first principles of things. So, for example, Taha Abdurrahman, who's a very famous Moroccan Islamic kind of philosopher and thinker, he wrote about the Arab Spring. He said that uprising is another ego, and that one ego cannot replace another ego. So he said, thus one should not remove oppression. The best thing to do is to struggle against one's own ego. So they will also appeal to ideas like the power of the dua, as opposed to engaging in material things, engaging in protests, engaging in boycotts, all of these sorts of things. A lot of these splits were very, very pronounced in the context of the Arab Spring. So in the US, where Islamism is more dominant, we saw a lot of splits from 2014 all the way up until the years after that, maybe the 4 or 5 years after that. We saw a very large number of splits between neo-traditionalists and Islamists. And a lot of these mirrored splits in the Arab world. So a good example of this is Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, rahmatullah alayhi. He was a Egyptian scholar who lived in exile in Qatar, and he was an Islamist scholar. And he was on a council where I believe he was president and Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya was vice president. And Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya eventually resigned from that council and then went to the UAE where he started his own council. So a lot of these splits were kind of mirrored in the Muslim world, in the US. A lot of these splits happening in the Muslim world were mirrored in the US. I remember in 2014, I was a senior in high school. And I remember I used to go to ISNA every single year. And I used to love to hear Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf speak at ISNA. I remember 2014, I was shocked that he was not coming to ISNA that year. And I don't think he has ever come back since. So a lot of these kind of splits, they saw their, they kind of happen in the United States post-Arab Spring. And then Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf specifically, he faced controversy for 2 statements that he made. One of these was, he spoke at the RIS conference, and he said that And both of these statements were made at RIS. He says the United States is, in terms of its laws, one of the least racist countries in the world. He said we have some of the best anti-discriminatory laws on the planet. We have between 15 and 18,000 homicides a year. 50% of crimes are black on black crime. That is twice as many. There are twice as many whites that have been shot by police, but nobody ever shows these videos. It's the assumption that the police are racist, and it's not always that case. I think it's very dangerous to broad stroke any police that shoots a black as immediately being considered racist. Sometimes these are African American police officers, and he says the police aren't all racist. And obviously, he faced a lot of criticism for these comments. And a lot of these comments are kind of almost Fox News talking points, right? Appeals to black on black crime do not really make all that much sense because the United States is a very segregated society. So oftentimes, African Americans live in areas where there are mostly African Americans around them, and that is the same with kind of white Americans. So obviously, these statements have a whole host of issues. On another level, and then also an appeal to black on black crime is also, there's also a lot of other issues with that statement. Like, I'll give an example. I have a friend of mine who I've known since I was 10 years old. And I remember when the genocide in Palestine started, he said to me, he said, why are you so concerned about, Israelis killing Palestinians? Don't Arabs in Syria kill each other and Arabs in, all these other countries kill each other? So it's a very kind of blatantly kind of racist kind of statement. And then there was another case where Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf at RIS, he said the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS exist on the same spectrum. And this also presents all sorts of a host of issues. One is, what does that statement really even mean? The other issue with that is that if you were saying that the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS exist on the same spectrum, you are basically saying that a whole host of American Muslim organizations, such as ISNA, such as CARE, such as the MSA, they are founded by basically people who are, all sorts of extremists and all of that. And one can have many, many critiques of the Muslim Brotherhood without suggesting that they need to be, labeled terrorists and imprisoned and tortured and, all of these sorts of things. In his apology for his first comments, Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf sort of reiterated that morality as opposed to structural racism is the biggest problem facing the Black American community today. So again, even in his apology, there's a sort of paternalism there. There's a whole host of issues there. So neo-traditionalists will very often be criticized for this sort of kind of spiritualization of politics. That, material conditions are not the problem that oppressed people face, but it is morality, it is, these sorts of things. But it is also important to note that oftentimes you'll read certain works and they will critique neo-traditionalists for these things, but it is important to note that this is not the case for all neo-traditionalists. A good example of this is Imam Amin Muhammad, who I mentioned earlier. A few days after Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf's comments at the RIS kind of convention, he wrote a Facebook post and he said, I have no desire to listen to someone present Islam in such a passive manner that I don't recognize it as Islam at all. And he says, Islam is the religion of truth. Get over it, shaking my head. And then Dr. Shadi al-Masri, who probably today runs one of the most popular kind of podcasts especially for like young Muslims, he said that traditionalists have this Sufi chic Siddi culture that's just soft and useless. And he says beads, math books, and weakness. Sufi chic is to love everything that the dominant society already approves of, like Rumi, but they will never touch any subject that ruffles feathers or earns backlash. Fear of blame, politically neutered. Unless the left approves of the cause, Sufi chic is always allied with some government or other. They will kick you while you're down if you end up on the wrong side of the popularity context. So this is also something important to note, that when people critique, oftentimes people, when they're talking about neo-traditionalism, they'll often kind of present it as though the politics of Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf and the politics of Abdullah bin Baya and the politics of these figures represent the entirety of the neo-traditionalist movement, which is just not the case. And you could even see this in the way that people talk about kind of neo-traditionalist politics internationally. A lot of people will have this idea where they will say, The Azhar itself, like Al-Azhar is, this institution that has been politically neutered. It is, all of this sort of stuff. And then when they present Azhari scholars, they will present a certain batch of Azhari scholars. But then they will ignore other Azhari scholars who are very critical. They will ignore someone like Sheikh Imad Ifat, rahmatullah alayh, who is considered to be they call him the Sheikh of the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, and they call him the Shahid al-Thawra. So people will ignore the fact that even within the neo-traditionalist, even within the traditionalist discourse in Muslim countries, a lot of shuyukh are oftentimes not okay with what is going on. Another good example will be that in living in authoritarian states, I know some teachers that after 2 or 3 years of knowing them, they started to tell me how they really feel about things behind closed doors. So oftentimes, the scholars in the Muslim world are not always there. They might be quiet publicly, but that does not necessarily reflect how they actually feel. But they might see it as sort of like a greater good or something like that. Another aspect of this is that a lot of neo-traditionalists will say that we favor a stable tyrannical regime over that of kind of anarchy and that sort of stuff. And many would present this as someone like Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti, the former Grand Mufti of Syria. He actually supported the revolution in Egypt, but opposed it in Syria. And they say one of the reasons for this is because Sheikh al-Bouti saw that rebellion in Syria was not actually going to overthrow the regime there, but it was going to lead to something worse, which was just a decade of civil war. And then another critique of neo-traditionalists will be their association with far-right movements and perennialists. The perennialist school, the most kind of famous kind of proponents of the perennial school are people like Martin Lings, people like Fritjof Schuon, Rene Guénon, Said Hossein Nasr, and others. These are some of really the most important thinkers in kind of Western kind of Muslim discourse, in English language kind of Muslim discourse. But they were of this school that kind of feared the tide of modernity would kind of wash away traditional religion. And they stated that all religious traditions all traditional religions were true at their core, but some of them would favor kind of certain particular religions. So they were Catholic perennials. They said the strength of the Catholic Church as an institution will make it strong in kind of fighting modernity and preserving traditional religion. There were other Muslim perennialists, and a lot of them had a similar idea of that. They say that Islam uniquely is able to kind of resist modernity in ways that other religions cannot. So some would also say things like, oh, Islam is the most perfect manifestation of truth. Others would say things, like I said, because it kind of defended against modernity better. So this school has served as an inspiration for far-right thinkers such as Steve Bannon, partially because they have a very, very strong belief in hierarchies. Because they said one aspect of of modernity was this idea of egalitarianism, that everyone is the same. And perennialists had this idea that no, not everybody is the same. Some people were born to do philosophy. Some people were born to sell bread. And basically that there is this kind of hierarchy. So, and a main issue with this hierarchy also was that it was also sometimes used to justify racism. So perennialism is kind of critique, neo-traditionalists are kind of critique for that because of their strong beliefs in hierarchies, that they are often kind of associated with the far right and with perennialists. And then they're also criticized for their belief in the unity of all religions, which is clearly antithetical to kind of Islamic scripture. So critics would respond and they would say things like, "Inna dina indallah al-Islam," that the only religion acceptable in the sight of Allah is Islam, which Allah says in Surah Imran. Most neo-traditionalists also, they will critique ideologies like Marxism and feminism, and many people will push back against them for that. So, like, for example, I'm not sure if you guys have come across Wala Kuwaisi's book on neo-traditionalism in Islam. She looks at 3 figures, that of Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf, that of Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, Dr. Timothy Winter, and then Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah. What I find interesting about that is that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad will very often say things politically that are just kind of ridiculous. Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, I have not really seen that for him. So one of her big focuses on Dr. Umar is that, oh, he criticizes Marxism and feminism and all of this sort of stuff. But I don't really understand why that is a kind of surprise, that conservative religious figures are not on board with Marxism and feminism and these sorts of things. Neo-traditionalists will also be critiqued for sharing platforms with right-wing socially conservative Americans. A good example of this would be that in 2012, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and Robert P. George, a conservative Catholic moral philosopher and a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton, they wrote letters together asking hotels not to have pornography services. And he oftentimes will share a platform with Robert P. George, and many have criticized Sheikh Hamza Yusuf for this, saying that Robert P. George is a Zionist, he's a supporter of American imperialism. He even often says things that are kind of slightly Islamophobic in the past. So why are you getting together with these kind of right-wing figures? So that is also another kind of critique that people will have of neo-traditionalists. So in conclusion, neo-traditionalism is at its surface a commitment to classical Sunni Islamic tradition in the context of madhabi fiqh, Ash'ari Aqidah or Maturidi Aqidah, and then authentic tasawwuf. But critics will often identify a lot of other issues within it. They will say its association with far-right movements and perennialism, the way it undermines leftist movements, its sort of spiritualization of politics, the retreat phenomenon, and an implicit theodicy that either ignores the problems of the world or takes away any materialist onus upon the individual to kind of change it. So yeah, so that is what I have with regard to neo-traditionalism. And yeah, you guys have any questions or any comments or anything on that?
We have a couple minutes for questions. Dr. Hisham is actually on an interview with BBC right now. So I'm going to ask a question, brother. I'm cited in the book by Dr. Wala a few times. I didn't really agree with how she cited me, but could you go into a little bit more how you were explaining about Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah, why she sounds perplexed with the fact that he's critical of the different kind of movements that come out of the left?
Uh-huh. In all honesty, I think a lot of critics of neo-traditionalism, part of the idea of that move, like I feel like of her book was to present neo-traditionalism as run by like these white guys who want to teach Muslims about Islam. Because if you want to talk about neo-traditionalists who have bad politics, you could identify someone like Abdullah bin Hamid. You could identify, many other people. So the inclusion of Dr. Umar there, I find to be really really strange in a sense. But yes, most like traditional Muslims will have critiques of Marxist and leftist movements. I think that is kind of a given. But yeah, does that answer the question or?
Yeah, her methodology, which I would never have accepted as a reviewer, was to go to retreats under the auspices of being a student, where you submit an application and your intention is to go as a student, and then you embed yourself as a hidden researcher and you collect data almost as a kind of spy or an operative. And then after you leave the retreat, you become this critical person and you kind of rewrite all of your conversations as interviews. I wouldn't have accepted that methodology, but there aren't many other people who've written about this particular phenomenon. But I wanted to know more. Did you think that her analysis was valid? Because I do see a trope of white people studying and kind of cosplaying as Arabs when they come back and dressing up like they are the sheikh, and that is a phenomenon. And I do think that is a valid analysis to look at it from, because the first iteration of the people who converted in the 70s did happen to be from upper class white backgrounds that afforded them the ability to kind of live the life of the contemplative
Whereas other people that came back, they weren't from that kind of cadre of upper white Anglo, society. They didn't have the patrons to support them in the same manner, right? But did you see that part of her analysis to be valid, or would you say it could be disproven? Because if you cite Abdullah Ali, I mean, he's an employee of the former, so he's not really independent.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there is, like, I remember when Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf made his comments at RAS, I remember I spoke to a friend of mine who's an imam in the Imam Din Muhammad community. And he said to me that, he said, I wouldn't say Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf is a racist. He said, what I would say about him is he's just an old white guy who's just kind of blind to the problems in society. And then he said that at the end of the day, he said he's a classist. And he said that I don't take my religion from classes. So I think there is a certain issue with a certain kind of culture amongst kind of neo-traditionalists where it's almost this kind of elitist, kind of classist kind of approach to tasawwuf. And I think that is an issue. Where I would kind of push back on that analysis is that, yes, Hamza Yusuf might be a classist. And yes, so-and-so other Abdul Hakim Murad might have that issue. And that classism leads to a certain way that they talk about politics with regard to Arab and South Asian immigrants, with the way that they talk about Black Americans. But at the same time, the neo-traditionalist movement also includes figures like Imam Amin Muhammad, who runs a masjid in the inner city, who is actively involved in the community around him, who is materially addressing the issues in his society. It also includes people like Dr. Shadi al-Masri, who talks about political issues in the United States, in the Arab world, he runs a soup kitchen, who his masjid runs an organization for, ex-convicts reintegrating themselves in society, all of this sort of stuff. So if the argument is that neo-traditionalism has that sort of element to it, I would agree with that. But if the argument is that this is an essential part of neo-traditionalism, which I feel like she sort of touches on, that's where I would kind of push back. And then that inclusion of Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah is where I find it to be a little bit strange, because Dr. Umar is someone who talks about politics. He will critique leftist movements, he will critique Marxism, he will critique feminism, all of that sort of stuff. But Dr. Umar is also someone who wrote a book on the kind of Islamic struggle in Syria. So that is
I
where
know about that, yeah, in Arabic, yeah.
Yeah, so that is where I would kind of push back on things.
82. Yeah.
If someone were to ask the question of what is the politics of neo-traditionalism, I would say there is not one answer to that question. In the same way, if someone were to ask what are the politics of Salafism, there's a wide gambit. You have Madkhalis who basically say you cannot protest, you cannot boycott, you have to obey the ruler, all of that. And then there's a whole other branch of Salafis who are much more willing to oppose the state, who might see it as an essential part of the religion to not associate with the state and all of that. So within neo-traditionalism, I would also say that there's a wide gambit of things.
So I guess I want to speak to that. I guess
Can you hear? Can you hear?
Yeah, when Sheikh Hamza made that statement, gave his apology. I think when I watched it, the thing that got me the most, not so much what he said, because I agree with what your friend said, is it's that the audience were like clapping. They just seemed just so happy and just like, wow. And I was just like, wow, because that's what really concerns me is all these people who listen to people like Sheikh Hamza. You're right, I mean, he's doing great work, mashallah, in his community and everything. But in people's mind, when they think of traditional Islam, neo-traditionalism, they don't think about Imam Amin. Your average person who loves Sheikh Hamza or loves the neo-traditional movement or thinks about it might not even know of his existence and the work that he does. So I think that it's true that it's not the whole picture, but it has more weight. It's more the exception to the rule. The people like Dr. What's his name? Shadi and I was also going to ask you what your thoughts are on Dr. Zainab Kaba's work, because she went in saying, I'm a researcher. She goes into, I mean, it's not exactly the same, but she goes into, I think there's the Island program, I think it's the Dream program, and one other place, maybe you'll say Tuna or the rest of it. But I'm just wondering what you think of her work, whether I have
Can you hear the question fully?
I'm actually not familiar with her work. What's her name?
Okay.
It just came out. Dr. Zainab Kava. I think it might maybe this year, I think.
What about
Oh.
Usama al-Azmi? Have you read his work?
Usama al-Azmi on Islam and the Arab revolutions, right?
But he's written on neo-traditionalism. He critiqued Sheikh Hamzah particularly.
I think Osama al-Azmi also falls into kind of like a similar issue, where if even someone like Sheikh al-Azhar Ahmad Tayyib, Sheikh al-Azhar Ahmad Tayyib is not someone who is kind of like a cheerleader of the state. He is basically as anti-government you can be in an authoritarian state like Egypt. A good example of this is when the Rabaa massacre happens, Sheikh al-Azhar Ahmad Tayyib basically disappears for 2 months. And then when a interviewer asks him about the Rabaa massacre, or Sheikh al-Azhar makes a statement where he says, things happened in that square that I do not approve of and that Azhar does not approve of. And then he does not make a public appearance for 2 months. When he makes that statement, that statement can be interpreted two different ways. And he purposely does that thing with plausible deniability. Sheikh al-Azhar also, before the Rabaa massacre, was calling for a sort of dialogue between the Brotherhood and the military. Sheikh al-Azhar Ahmad Tayyib also, in Egypt, when the current president who came through like a military coup, Abdel Fattah Sisi, he wanted to get rid of verbal divorce or get rid of written divorce. No, get rid of verbal divorce and make it that it can only be written down. And Sheikh al-Azhar Tayyib says on TV to the president, he said, "You've created a huge problem for me," and he very much pushed back against that. And other scholars within Azhar push back against that, and they say that words have meaning in Islam, and we cannot do this, and all of this sort of stuff. So I also, one thing about Dr. Usama's work is I feel like where I would push back is I would say that there actually is pushback against the state within the kind of Egyptian religious establishment. There are certain scholars, people like Sheikh Ali Goma, who are very much kind of cheerleaders of the state and who made, very problematic statements where, they told the Egyptian military to shoot protesters and all of this sort of stuff. But there is also this sort of element of Azhari scholars that is opposed to the Brotherhood, but also opposed to the state. And I would argue that that kind of third way is probably where most Egyptians fall and where most Azhari scholars would fall if they had the freedom to actually kind of say what they want. So that would be kind of my pushback on kind of Dr. Osama's thing. Interestingly enough, also, I feel like to a certain generation, if you were to kind of ask who are the main kind of neo-traditionalist scholars, they would probably say Hamzah Yusuf, probably Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, Abdul Hakim Murad, these sorts of people. But I think about in my kind of generation, and I'm someone like I actually turned 29 yesterday. So I feel like the people kind of like under 30, if you were to ask them who are the main neo-traditionalists, Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf would not be someone relevant to them. They are people who are listening to like Dr. Shadi and like Dr. Amin Muhammad and these sorts of people. So their engagement with neo-traditionalism does not have that same political baggage that it would have for kind of like the older generation.
I think that's true because I think about my kids. They love Dr. Shadi.
Yeah.
Masjid, they're like all there. But the challenge, I'm sorry, I just want to say this. The challenge that happens is that you've still got people who run institutions, businesses, community organizations who are still shaped by, the I guess the neo-traditionalism of the I guess the forefathers, whether you call them the white forefathers of that particular movement. So I understand that there is some diversity there, but in terms of when you're moving within the Muslim community, I think there's still a lot of weight and power that way of thinking has within the community. And if, for example, people like Dr. Shadi aren't speaking up and saying, okay, this is how we should see blackness and these kind of statements are not okay, people are not going to know how to process what is being said. So I feel like, okay, maybe he's not saying those same statements, but if you're not giving clarity to your followers about how we should see these issues and how we should understand the history of this country so that we don't have these stereotypical ways of looking at our community and encouraging this idea of looking down on other groups, then we're not going to be able to deal with these issues. I know alhamdulillah he does speak about a lot of things, but that particular thing I haven't heard.
Dr. Shadi was an early participant in the 98 Rihla. So the Rihla retreats, I think they started in 97 or 98.
Started in England. Actually, let's go back to that again. Sorry. So it started in England, and the people who started it were primarily Black Brits, Nigerians, other groups who started it, and it was very affordable. I went to the one in Fez. It cost me £300 to go. You know, I know nowadays I couldn't even afford to even think about going to it, but it was very affordable. A lot of working class, regular people went to these things, and it became this American expensive elite thing.
We used to call it deemed expensive.
Well, it wasn't like that in the earlier. The first 4 years at least, it wasn't like that. From 95, 96 till about 2000, it wasn't.
I'd actually like to investigate the usefulness of our classification of neo-traditionalism. I don't think it actually serves the purpose now with this kind of new wave. It doesn't seem useful to throw Sheikh Amin Muhammad, Dr. Shadi al-Masri under the same category.
I agree. So proposal.
Well, I don't necessarily have a name, but I think it makes more sense to use almost a continuum model, where you have political quietism on one end, political activism on the other, and an interaction with tradition and an interaction with modernity as kind of their slant.
Yeah. This is how I feel, in a sense, that neo-traditionalism has almost become a term that it doesn't really give you much. Another good example of this,
Salafis don't like you, like that's
yeah, because another good example of this is that a lot of people my age who study in South Asian madaris, they have none of the political baggage or even familiarity with these conversations. Because if you were studying in like a Deobandi madrasa, Mufti Taqi Usmani is a neo-traditionalist to the core, in the sense he's teaching Hanafi fiqh, Maturidi Aqidah, he's Naqshbandi in his tasawwuf, but at the same time, he speaks out very fervently against the Abraham Accords. Within Pakistan, it's a very completely different relation to the fact that Pakistani scholars have complete freedom of speech. I mean, not complete, but like,
Kind of.
yeah, they have immense freedom of speech. So, for example, when the Uyghur issue happened in Pakistan, and basically Imran Khan, when he was president, he was basically denying it and all of that. Mufti Taqi, left and right, was contradicting Imran Khan on this issue. And he said Uyghur Muslims are being oppressed. Muslims around the world have a duty to act. It's shameful what the government is doing, all of this sort of stuff. Another good example of this would be, and this might be one that maybe people don't like as much, when COVID happened, the Pakistani government shut down or ordered for the masajid to be shut down. And Mufti Taqi Usmani released a statement, and he said it is a sunnah mu'akkada to pray in the masjid. He said you should pray in the masjid, but socially distance and all of this sort of stuff. But he completely contradicted the government on that issue. And I remember, I think Yasser Qadhi released a statement on this where he said Mufti Taqi I believe him to be a righteous scholar and a wali and all these sorts of things, but he should not have said that with regard to people praying in the masajid and stuff like that. But if you study in a non-Arab context, which many people do, they'll study in madaris in South Asia, they'll study at Deobandi madaris in the United States, like Dar al-Qasim and Qalam and Dar es-Salaam in Chicago. They'll study in South Africa. They have no relationship to those politics, but they're still, madhabi, they're still Maturidi or Ashari in their Aqidah. They're still people who are proponents of tasawwuf. So there's kind of an issue there. Another issue that I feel like I struggle with in my own life, and perhaps people could weigh this critique on this is what the sister mentioned with regard to someone like Dr. Shadi and stuff, is that I will sometimes study with scholars and I benefit from them. And I really believe that they are good, sincere people. And sometimes even after class or something, I'll kiss their hands and stuff. But I think their political views are, awful. And then someone might even ask me. I remember there's one scholar in Egypt who's a very, very prominent scholar. I pray Jummah with him every single Friday. And he has a dhikr after, he has a class after. I go to his after Fajr classes. I really, really benefit from this scholar. Sometimes he will say stuff about politics, especially in Jummah khutbahs. It will ruin my day. I'll be complaining about it. The khutbah will end at 2. It'll be 5 or 6 p.m. and I'll be complaining to my wife about it. And my wife actually said to me something once. She said, if you disagree with his politics so fervently, why do you pray Jummah with him every week? And I said, because when it comes to the Islamic sciences, he's amazing. So this is something that I really, really struggle with. I'll give another example. One of my friends, he ran into Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf at a protest for Palestine in New York, like maybe a couple of days ago. When he saw Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf at the protest, he said to him, like, shouldn't you be ashamed of yourself? Like, why are you even here? And him and Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf got into an argument. I remember I was thinking, if I saw him at a protest, even if I disagree with the stuff he says about Palestine, I probably would not have done that. I probably would have shook his hand. I would have said, thank you for, everything you've done for Muslims in America, all of this sort of stuff. Even though my friend who was upset with him, we share probably the exact same politics. But I don't know. So that's something that I struggle with, where it's
Sorry, I'm a little bit confused. Which side was he protesting for?
Oh, that's not fair.
No. I'm confused about the framing.
It's okay. معلش.
Oh.
هنعدي. يلا كمل.
he was on the Palestinian side.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm a little
Yes.
bit confused on why your friend was saying he should be ashamed of himself.
Because of statements he's made in the past.
Okay.
Yeah. With regard to, I think he said something along the lines of like, oh, Palestinians, if they were just nonviolent, they would have a state by now. Things like, oh, Palestinians have been traumatized by, I think Wada mentioned this in her book actually, that they've been traumatized by modernity. They're not able to properly purify themselves because they're just so traumatized by the oppression of the state and all this sort of stuff. So things like that. But it's always an internal struggle that I have. That do I have a duty to say, oh, so-and-so scholar is this normalizer, is someone who perpetuates oppression or all of that? Or is it okay for me to say, yes, he might be dead wrong on politics, but I still find him to be an authority when he talks about the works of Ghazali or when he talks about fiqh or when he talks about Aqidah and that sort of stuff.
So do you think that the neo-traditionalist movement, when we classify it, should be time-bound in a sense? Because it seems like these are not, politics are not an essential quality of the movement.
Yeah, I don't really.
Hamza, دي واحدة بس. What do you mean by time bound?
We've labeled Dr. Shadi al-Masri as a neo-traditionalist, Sheikh Amin Muhammad, but there's such a the classification is no longer.
So when you say time bound, you mean like from this year until this year, and then after that it's
or generations, like tabaqat.
Got it. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Did you get that?
Yeah, it's a hard question. But yes, to an extent. I find neo-traditionalism not to be a very kind of precise term in that context. That it is almost kind of thrown at people. Like if someone were to ask me, oh, are you a neo-traditionalist? I would say yes, in the sense that I believe in madhabi fiqh, Ashari, Maturidi, Aqidah. I believe in the institution of tasawwuf. But also no, in a sense, if it means these sort of associations with kind of a certain brand of politics, a certain brand of these sorts of things. So yeah, it becomes kind of difficult. The other question is for example, even a lot of figures that neo-traditionalists promote do not necessarily kind of share all of these sorts of things. So a good example is someone like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayah. Yes, he's madhabi in his fiqh, but Sheikh Abdullah also has certain positions that go outside the four madhabs. And you could extend that to Sheikh Ali Guma. You could extend that to a lot of kind of figures within the movement. So even what does it mean to believe in madhabi fiqh? Does it mean that you have a certain madhab and you never give fatwa outside of it? Does it mean that when you give fatwa outside of your madhab, you give it with certain conditions? Some people give the condition that the act has to be valid according to one of the four madhabs. Others will say that you can even do it in a way that's invalid according to all four madhabs. So, and then the question, can you give fatwa outside of the four madhabs? So these are kind of certain questions that are kind of I don't know. These are also kind of issues with the kind of preciseness of the term also.
kind of moving away from definitions around these particular strands, uh, from a broader sense, from a macro sense, have you noticed with, not to put the onus on you to identify which particular group, but have you noticed certain practices, irrespective of what group it's coming from, that might be bottlenecking, hindering, or just counterproductive to Western Muslims or American Muslims in terms of the objectives of the Sharia? Is there something that in your studies of these strands or these practices that you notice is clearly um, a bad habit of the Muslim community that we really should move on from?
I think one thing would be, one of my teachers said this in the context of, he said that, and particularly in the context of Dar Ifta, because regular Egyptians will come to us for fatwa. But one of my teachers said, in order to understand Egypt, you need to understand social class. So he said, you might get the same question, but the way you answer it to someone who comes from a village versus someone who is a working class Egyptian versus someone who is a rich Egyptian, you are going to approach it in different ways because Egyptians, by their class, you kind of understand certain values, all of these certain things. My analogy to that would be that in order to understand America, you have to understand race. If you do not understand race, you are not going to understand America. So I think it's very, very important for Muslims in the United States to do that. And also for Muslims in the United States to understand that the history of Islam in America is premised on Black Muslims. And Islam in America, almost 100% up until probably like 95% up until the 1960s. And then in a large kind of proportion after that is a largely kind of Black phenomenon. So one should not be in a position of leadership in the United States, in Muslim communities, if they're not familiar with the works of someone like Malcolm X or Imam Muhsin Muhammad or Imam Jamil al-Amin or other kind of movements like that. And I think that is a place where, especially kind of suburban kind of Muslims or kind of more kind of young urban professional kind of communities, that is a place where they kind of often fall. Another thing is that I think oftentimes the kind of focus on madhabi fiqh is oftentimes a little bit kind of difficult. So there will be some situations where as Muslims, you almost have to be a little bit creative in how you apply things. And some of these things oftentimes will kind of ruffle a little bit of feathers. A good example of this will be that, what a good example will be? A good example of this would be, let's say there's a married couple or there's an unmarried couple and they're unmarried and they have children. And then that family becomes Muslim. And let's say they do the nikah contract after that and they're married and all of that. Can the children in that marriage have attribution to their father? The position of all four madhabs is that the al-walad lil-firash, that child does not have nasab to their father. But there are contemporary fatwa, like that of Muhammad Rifat Usman of Azhar, who said that basically DNA tests can establish paternity even for children who were born out of zina. So I think that it is a very kind of useful position that is technically kind of outside of the four madhabs, and it's based on kind of a contemporary fatwa. So these are kind of things that I think Muslims need to be a little bit creative on. But the problem is that oftentimes lenient fiqh like kind of waters things down, and oftentimes too hard fiqh kind of makes things like overly difficult for people. So it's like the scholar has to be kind of smart, and people in community leadership have to be kind of smart in how they apply these things. And like what one of my teachers said is anyone can be lenient all the time and anyone can be strict all the time. But you need to know when to be strict and when to be lenient with the goal of getting people close to Allah.
Jazakallah.
Which is stuck.
Another question?
We had a little bit.
I could ask a question just related to that point. Why would they go for establishment of a DNA test for paternity as opposed to just using the Quran?
As opposed to using what?
Iqra, like he just says, those are my children. We take it that as a testimony.
The case that Hamza is talking
Yeah.
about is when the father doesn't recognize, but also we're gonna go offline for this, Eilish.
Oh,
Or actually, if you want to like address that, but generally in Shafiq, well, actually not just in Shafiq,
Yeah.
if it happens outside of marriage, that was Africa.
Yeah.
Okay, so the fatwa that he's talking about is overriding that
Yeah.
and establishing paternity, which is why you have this very peculiar ruling about what's permissible in terms of marriage, because it's not recognized as establishing paternity or relationship.
Yes, I'm familiar with
Okay,
that.
yeah. Or another good example might be that it might even further complicate that is, let's say a woman is married, but she's separated. Oftentimes in Western culture, when people are separated, they might start dating other people. So let's say a woman is separated from her husband and they don't live together, any sort of that, but they're not officially divorced, they're still legally married. While she's separated, she has a boyfriend. She gets pregnant from that boyfriend. According to all four madhabs, the child of that relationship, the father is the husband of their mother, not the man that she was dating at the time. So that creates all sorts of issues. And these issues do arise kind of in community environments. I'm sure you guys have come across these things. So these are cases where it might be wiser to kind of give fatwa outside of the four madhabs. Another example that I'll give is there are certain acts that things like the Mawlid, things like gatherings of zikr and all these sorts of things. I think these are good events that really, aside from even the fiqh of things, these are good events for young children to go to, like growing up. They're celebrations that kids look up to, all of this sort of stuff. And these are really important things to do as Muslims in the West because they almost like create a culture. So I think that would also be another example of that. One of my teachers, who he lives in the United States, he said, I find it so peculiar that there are masajid in America that will do Halloween, where it's a halal alternative to Halloween. And they will have candy for the kids. It's this sort of celebration. But then when the Mawlid happens, the masjid is not doing anything. So you are almost trying to Islamicize, you're trying to create Islamic alternatives to American holidays, but then you are ignoring the actual Islamic alternatives that exist. And oftentimes the leadership of the masjid, they don't actually have an issue with the Mawlid, but they just say, oh, if we do the Mawlid, half the community will be upset with us, so we don't want to push back and all of that sort of stuff.
Sorry, talking about like the younger generation, I'm thinking about how there's so many educational institutions that come out of the Yomani tradition across the country, and the importance of, I guess, distinguishing them from the other groups, neo-traditionalists. So I guess my question is, how do, especially the ones who are based in America, you're talking about the importance of leaders understanding the American story. How are they being prepared in these kind of spaces to understand that?
Uh-huh. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you too well.
How are the people who are studying in the traditional or the neo-traditional Yoruban institutions being prepared to lead in America and understand the story of America so they can serve in
You said in Deobandi institutions?
I'm thinking about the institutions that come out of that tradition in America, whether it's Column or it's what's that place in Detroit?
So you're talking
any
about
of those
Deobandi inspired
inspired, yes, in
the
America,
US.
yes.
Neo-Bundis.
Neo-Bandi?
Yeah, Neo-Bundis is the word they have for it.
Neo-Bandi. That's cool.
I don't know. That's a good question. But I would say it's important for those institutions to have certain classes like Islam in America, have certain classes even on the anthropology of religion or something like that. I can tell you in the context of Egypt, there are a lot of Western students in Egypt who are clueless to Egyptian society, are clueless to the certain kind of politics around things. I remember, for example, one time I was going to a Mawlid with the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, with Sheikh Ali Guma. There was a South African classmate of mine going to the Mawlid, and it was one of our teachers from who works at Dar Ifta who was also there. And as we're going to the Mawlid, the South African student says, everybody loves Sheikh Ali Guma in Egypt except for the Wahhabis. Me and my teacher from Dar Ifta, we started laughing. We're like, that is 100% not true. He's extremely controversial for his lenient fatwa, for his politics, all sorts of stuff. So then the student like says to me, like, wait, why are you guys laughing? And I said, he's actually very controversial. And then the student says, he asked me, he said, why is he controversial? And then I say to him, I said, we can talk about this another time. And then my teacher from Dar Ifta says to me, he says, don't tell him. He said, if he doesn't know, he's like, it's probably better that way or something like that. So a lot of Western tulab in Egypt are very clueless to the kind of world around them. And oftentimes, I would assume that also applies to a lot of tulab who are studying in madaris. That it becomes a world where you spend a lot of time reading very important text and all of these sorts of things, and then you probably don't spend a lot of time reading other stuff. I have actually had teachers in Egypt who have said stuff like that to me. They said the talib al-ilm shouldn't read the news. He said it's a waste of your time. Study your books, all of that. But then at the same time, I've had other teachers who say to me, it's actually very important that even if your full-time thing is that you study the Islamic sciences, you spend 30 minutes a day, an hour a day, reading anthropology, reading history, reading about politics, reading about these sorts of things, so you can be kind of well-rounded. And then I think that is also an issue. A lot of people will look up to certain scholars as figures of religious authority. And then because they're not that concerned about politics, they don't know a lot about politics, they will often kind of regurgitate the political views of their teachers that are not particularly well thought out or something like that. So yeah, so that is also another kind of thing that arises from that. I think a good work on this, by the way, is that of it's called What is a Madrasa by Ibrahim Musa, who he talks about studying at Nadwatul Ulama in India. And he talks about one of the kind of reforms that he proposes to the kind of Dars Nizami curriculum is he said that students should be reading anthropology and history and these sorts of disciplines.
I'm really glad that this is a private Zoom call in Chicago and that the Egyptian state isn't watching this because we might not see you again. But Hamzah, thank you so much. That was very useful. I think you raised some interesting questions and the class raised some interesting questions for you. Do we have any others or can I let Hamzah? Okay, Tana will get the last question. Bismillah.
Do you find any trends or any methodologies within the Western context, specifically America, that you find pretty destructive to the broader objectives of the Sharia?
Give him a list. Give him a list.
Yeah. One would be, I think post 2020, with regard to COVID, everything went online. So before, in order to speak about Islam, there were already people who were unqualified speaking about Islam. But 2020 and beyond, it became a lot worse. And there was this kind of big trend of not just Salafi speakers, but a specific brand of Salafism called Madkhalism, who are super quietist, super pro-state, all of this sort of stuff. And I think, although in real life they do not have a lot of traction, they have gotten a lot of traction on the internet. And as a result of that, they have been particularly attractive to young men. And I know that a lot of MSAs have kind of experienced just kind of a very kind of half-baked kind of understanding of Islam that has not kind of went well. Like I'll give an example. A couple of years ago, I had this MSA reach out to me and they said, are women allowed to pray in the musalla? And I said, obviously. And they said that there are certain brothers in the MSA who say that the women shouldn't be praying in the musalla. They should be praying in their dorm rooms because the Prophet ﷺ said that salah in her house is better than salah in the masjid. And I was kind of surprised by this kind of form of thinking. So I think that is kind of one current. I'm obviously not a Salafi, but I do not think that Salafism itself is necessarily destructive. There are many kind of moderate Salafis who do not have that kind of thinking. So I think the more precise way to speak would be about the kind of madkhalis and that sort of kind of extreme kind of Salafism. Because someone like Sheikh Salah al-Sawi, who teaches at Mishka, is someone who's very much more moderate in that regard. And he actually has a PhD from Azhar. His advisor was Sheikh Ahmed Tahariyan, the Sheikh of the Malikis in Egypt, rahmatullah alayh. Someone like Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj also is someone extremely. I don't know if you would. Yeah, Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj, that's his name, right? Yeah, he's someone who is not in the. It's hard to even know if he's even a Salafi at that point or if he's just kind of like a Taymiyan. And you could put like Sheikh Yasser Qalbi in that same category, people like that. I think another issue in the United States is a sort of like a lot of these places that are sort of dominated by Islamism, a lot of the time you go to like, the Jummah khutbah or something, and they'll just be talking about current events. There's actually very little talk about religion. There was one masjid in Northern Virginia that people used to joke that they used to call it Masjid Siyasa. They would say if you don't watch the news, if you didn't watch the news that week, don't worry, just go to Jummah and you'll get the entire rundown. So I see that from a lot of people of the kind of Islamist variety, where you go to the Jummah khutbah and the entire khutbah is just about political stuff. And I do think it's important to talk about politics, but I just don't think politics should be even 50% of what a sheikh talks about. I think it should be maybe like 20 or 30% or something like that, if even that high. So I think that might be another problem. What are other problems? I think
What
other
about celebrity culture?
Yes, that's obviously another issue. It goes back to social media that a lot of people have become, they've gotten certain platforms on social media, and because of that, they are seen as sources of legitimacy. There's also a big issue that I've seen that a lot of students will come to Egypt, they'll spend like a year here, and then they'll go back and they're treated like they're Sheikh al-Islam, even if they've completed no formal program. In a year in Egypt, probably all they were studying is Arabic. They weren't even really studying the Islamic sciences on a real level or any of this sort of stuff. And then they will go back and they'll get jobs as imams of a masjid. And I don't know what they're going to be teaching for their congregations because all they learned in Egypt was like Arabic vocab and Arabic grammar and these sorts of things. So that is another issue. There's a certain crisis of authority. It's something I've actually thought about that maybe in the same way that other professions have certain councils that someone needs to get certified by the council, maybe take an exam, do an interview or something like that. Maybe someone should set up almost like an imam certification council and like masjid boards when they're hiring imams, because a lot of these masjid board members don't know what these things are. They can reach out to kind of this external body that might be 5 or 6 people that properly studied, and they can interview the person, get their credentials, all of that, and then tell the masjid, he's qualified, or he's reached this level, or he's not qualified, or something like that.
It's good in theory.
Good in theory.
It's a good idea in theory. Yeah.
So thank you very much. We appreciate your time and all of the effort. I told the class, this is a practitioner sort of session in the sense that, of course, you've thought about this sort of stuff a lot. You live and have lived through a lot of it directly. So I'm glad that they've had the chance to engage with you. And I encourage you, as I think I've done before, to write some of this stuff up and maybe publish. But if not, we will still ask you to come back next year, inshallah. So thank you very much, and I hope the class will join me in expressing our appreciation.